the ESI data map, what inside counsel and records managers need to know. A few housekeeping notes I'd like to start out with is the attendees' phones are on mute, but you are encouraged to ask questions during the presentation by typing them into the box with the header, enter a question for the staff. Make sure you type in the box first, type your question, then click the send button below the box. Each attendee will receive a PDF copy of the PowerPoint presentation within a couple days after the webinar. And we are recording this webinar, and we will be making it available from Quarles' blog site, ediscovery.quarles.com. I'd like to turn it over briefly to Mike Peebles with Hewlett-Packard. And Mike, who is one of our sponsors, along with NextPage, is going to talk a bit about what Hewlett-Packard is doing in this space, which I think is particularly exciting since a lot of the organizations I work with use Hewlett-Packard products in their IT infrastructure. So Mike, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, John. So my name is Mike Peebles. I'm part of HP's information management team. It's a dedicated team within HP software, and we focus on delivering solutions to help organizations more easily comply with litigation, discovery requests, compliance with regulations, and manage really explosive data growth. Now you're going to hear John talk about an ESI data map, and Lisa talk about the connection between that data map and records management and how this all fits within eDiscovery. And what, we use those tools within information management as the groundwork to say, how now do you automate these processes? And our solutions give organizations tools to, implement flexible retention policies, protect content from change or deletion, which is especially important when it comes to litigation. We can show an audit log, produce audit logs to see who had access to data, when they accessed it, and all in an infrastructure that can scale to managing billions of objects and searching across all of those objects within just seconds, which is extremely important if you go into a meet and confer, to be prepared to understand what kind of search terms do you want to focus on and which ones don't you want to focus on. And we do this, one of the approaches HP takes in this space is we work on both structured data, right, so databases, data warehouse, CRM, and ERP systems, but also across unstructured data, so email, Office documents, SharePoint, which is growing quite rapidly, audio, video files, and we also pull in physical documents. We can manage the location of where those are. And we do this in a structure that fits it to the needs of the data, and we find there's two types of data. One is that high volume, such as email and databases, where setting a policy enables how you manage that data. And so things for databases and email, you can set a policy on how those data elements will be applied. So really a high volume, lower touch type of approach. But also at a user level, we can manage data that is a lower volume and a higher touch, things like personnel records or contracts teams that have different or highly flexible retention times. Now, one of the advantages of being proactive and putting an information management in place, and you can see how we fit in the eDiscovery map, is getting that groundwork laid and getting those tools in place so when the litigation hold comes in or when you even need to use the same process for showing compliance, we can go in and you have that structure laid. And so it's not reinventing the wheel every time you have to go through and do this. But you also get some functionality from migrating data from primary storage off into a structure that's designed for long-term data retention that gives you other benefits within your organization, such as a tool to enable knowledge workers in their day-to-day job to find what information is important to them and find it quickly so they don't spend time searching for data, and then they know that they have the authoritative document as well. Right? We can improve application performance. You give the ability to defer some capital expenditures because you can manage data more effectively. And we see organizations doing more in this as data grows and budget shrinks. They implement technologies like deduplication, but more and more they're being pushed into to doing classification, right? And also improve application availability and uptime, because the cost of backup are lower as you're managing less data. And so I guess just to wrap this up, whether you're looking to implement an email management solution for Exchange or Domino, we can help with our integrated archive platform, or extracting data from a database application, whether it's Oracle or SQL Server with HP database archiving software, or enable users to classify documents and apply a retention time with records management software such as HP's Trend software, or do optimizing e-discovery, right? Implement a search that reduces the amount of electronic stored information that has to be reviewed by legal counsel. We can call down that data as well. And so you see how our solutions map into the DRM model. That's a key piece of our functionality, and we'd love to hold a conversation about how we may be able to help with your solutions. And so I guess with that, John, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. And just a few quick things about the presenters today. My name's John Collins. I'm the founder and vice president of consulting for the Ingersoll firm. I'll be presenting an overview of the ESI data map. Lisa Berry-Taman is a senior consultant with Consulting, and Lisa will be reviewing the connection between data mapping and a RIM, Records Information Management Program. And then Kelly Twigger is a partner in the commercial litigation group at Quarles & Brady and heads up their records retention and electronic discovery team. And Kelly will be pulling these threads together and discussing issues around producing ESI and data mapping. So the agenda is, we just heard from Mike Peebles with HP talking about some of their technology to address e-discovery. I'm going to cover the ESI data map. Then Lisa will go with the section on the RIM and data mapping connection. Then Kelly will provide her discussion about producing ESI and data mapping. And then we're going to have a second discussion from one of our sponsors. Next page, again, some useful technology to addressing these issues at a fundamental level. And we're going to have an extended question and answer period, so roughly between probably 1 Eastern and 1:30 Eastern time. We're going to address your questions in an extended Q&A. So with that, let's dive right into the meat and potatoes of the presentation, an overview of the ESI data map. So I'm going to cover what is an ESI data map, how do you build it, how do you maintain an ESI data map, how do you use it, and what are some of the benefits of an ESI data map. So we're going to be sprinting through some of this material, but I am going to try to hit the most critical elements of these different topics. When I first start talking to lawyers, in-house and outside counsel, records management professionals, and IT folks, I basically tell them an ESI data map is a comprehensive and defensible inventory or catalog of an organization's IT infrastructure with a particular emphasis on those elements that house information, or ESI, whatever you want to call it, that might be relevant in any kind of legal proceeding, litigation, certainly regulatory proceeding, investigations, audit, etc. So with that backdrop, let's take a look at what is in an ESI data map. And I'm going to highlight several sections of the data maps that I've created for clients. The first section I'm going to look at is the master inventory. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time showing you some executive summaries. And these are really key because they break down the most critical elements of the IT infrastructure in a high level of detail and with context. And I think you'll see that as I go through it. So what I'm going to do here is click, and you'll see in a moment a table of contents for a relatively large ESI data map. This particular document is 190 pages. And what I want to show you first is the master inventory. Now, the master inventory is designed to be a comprehensive laundry list, if you will, of all the applications that exist within an organization's IT infrastructure. But the master inventory is typically broken down into tiers. And the tiers are really designed to prioritize the different systems based on their relevancy to the organization's risk management and litigation portfolio. So Tier 1 is typically those applications and systems that have been deemed most likely to be relevant to litigation or investigations. So I'm going to click on the section, the particular example here, SAS Institute, which is a software application, and spend a couple moments here showing you what type of information we have. So bear with me. And what I've done here is you can see I've circled some of the key elements. So we've got system and application, description of the system and application. So there's a brief description of what the system does. And then down at the bottom, who the IT contact is. So if I click on the link here, it's going to jump over to who is the key contact from an IT perspective for this particular system. And if we go back to the information, you can see additional information that's critical. When was the system first deployed by the company? Where is the data stored? And then a key element is what is the native file format for this particular data source? And here we can see it's a DB2 database. Has there been any system-wide purging or deletion of data? Is the system backed up? And then who are the users of the system? So very key information from in a discovery or records context. So that's Tier 1. So we just looked at Tier 1. Let's take a look at Tier 2. So this is a set of information that is a set of applications that have been deemed to be less critical from a litigation portfolio standpoint. So we can see we still have some information here which is helpful. Obviously the name of the system, a brief description of what the system does, and then who the IT contact is, and then the status of that system. But we don't spend as much time gathering information about the system because, in my experience, most organizations, particularly Fortune 500 type companies, have hundreds, if not thousands, of different systems and applications. And it's just not cost effective to try to get a high level of detail, nor is it necessary to get a high level of detail about each one of the systems. So let's jump back to the table of contents. So what we were just looking at is the master inventory broken down into Tier 1 and Tier 2. Let's take a quick look at one of the detailed executive summaries, and in this case we're going to look at the email section. Now I'm going to scroll down through this relatively quickly, and I'm not expecting you to be able to read this as I scroll through it, but I just want to give you an idea of the level of detail. So there's two important elements here. One is detail. We need to be detailed because the document needs to be defensible, number one. Number two is we also want to lend context because whoever's reading this document, we need to provide them with some context around the systems and, more importantly, the configuration of the systems. But I'm going to stop here at one of the critical points, which is where users store email and how users access email. And in any given situation, this is not going to be a standard sort of one-way fits all. Every organization is going to configure their email differently. So here what you see is I've got Domino Web Access is one set of users. I've got Domino Web Access with something called DOLS, or Domino Offline Access. And then if I scroll down a bit further, you can see there's a user population that accesses email through the Lotus Notes client. So in addition to telling the reader of the document how users access email, there's a detailed discussion about where the users can store their email based on their access methodology. And in this particular document, what I wanted to show you today is that there's basically 5 major categories of access and 5 major categories of location where users can store email. So it's never a simple, they can store email here and this is the only place they can store it. It's always multiple locations, and this breaks it down in exceptional detail. So let's jump back to the table of contents. So that's the email section. There's also a section on file and print servers, which is where a lot of your unstructured content, Word documents and PowerPoints are going to be stored. I'm not going to spend any time going into any details about this section. I just want to give you a flavor for the level of detail. And then the next section I want to dwell on for a moment is SAP. Now this particular organization, a lot of their critical information is stored in SAP. If you're not familiar with SAP, it is a ERP, or Enterprise Resource Planning software. And essentially what this is used for in a lot of organizations is really kind of some of the backbone computing and functional information is stored in these types of systems. So things like financial data, sales information, inventory, warehousing, product development. Computerized or information or ESI that is associated with those areas a lot of time will be found in an SAP system. And one of the things I want to point out here is that what I try to do in the data maps is provide a lot of expository and introductory text to help explain to the reader of the document what the systems do, what their purpose is, because the presumption that I take is that this person doesn't know anything about technology when they're reading the document. Now, Kelly later on is going to show another document which even breaks this down further in her outside counsel guide. But in any event, so what I want to do is scroll down here and just stop on a particular section to give you an idea of what we're doing in this type of with this type of system. So with SAP, there's typically multiple places where the data can be stored. In this particular organization, based on their configuration, there's two major categories where the SAP data can be found. One is in the system itself, in the SAP system proper, and there's even multiple places within the system that it can be found. And then the SAP data will also be found in user-accessible storage locations, and you can see I break down here those various locations. So that's kind of give you a flavor of what's in an ESI data map. The next thing I want to point out very quickly is what's not an ESI data map, and I find sometimes there's disconnects with regards to what the legal department at a corporation will think their IT people knows about the IT infrastructure. So if I click on this, this is going to show you the type of documentation that an IT group would typically maintain about the IT infrastructure, and you can see it's quite a bit different. It is indeed it is a map, but the type of information that's here is not particularly helpful to a records manager or a legal professional. Really no context around what the system does, really no information about what kind of data might be stored on these various servers. Really what we see here is the interrelationship from a networking standpoint of the various systems. This is very helpful to the IT folks, not particularly helpful to legal and record professionals. This type of document, however, is helpful in building a data map, but it's really, again, not to beat a dead horse, not particularly helpful in and of itself. So how do we build one of these data maps? Really, one of the key elements is to convene a project team, which should definitely consist of in-house legal, potentially outside counsel, records management, and potentially line of business management. It's key to get executive sponsorship, but the kickoff meeting really is meant to define the scope of the project and really kind of hash out what is the organization's litigation and risk management portfolio. Now, once we've hashed out those issues, then we start sort of the heavy lifting, which is gathering information about the organization's IT infrastructure. So the first document that I use is a document I've developed over the years, which is a survey. And this is meant to cast a wide net over the organization's IT infrastructure. And basically what this document is designed to do is allow the IT project, the members of the project team from the IT department go through and relatively quickly check off what systems do they have. And if it's not listed here, they can just write it in. So this is meant to be a very easy document for the IT folks to fill out in the course of a half hour or an hour. Now, once this document's completed, the next step is to compile the results into a compilation document. So what I'll typically do is take this document, sit down with the project team members, and we'll assign tiers. Remember the tiers that I talked about in the master inventory? So what I'll do here is with the project team, we'll assign tiers. Tier 1 being the most critical applications from a litigation portfolio and risk management perspective, Tier 2 being less important. And you could have Tier 3, Tier 4. I mean, it really is going to be based on the dynamic and really how much time and effort the organization wants to invest in building the data map. But I think you get the idea. Now, once we've identified the Tier 1 and Tier 2 systems, then the super heavy lifting takes place, which is getting into the nuts and bolts of how these IT systems are configured and what the infrastructure consists of. Now, the way that I do that is I use a series of worksheets, surveys, questionnaires, and interviews. Now, this is an example of a worksheet I use to gather information about a Microsoft Exchange and Outlook environment. And you can see the level of detail that we're seeking. So, for example, I'm looking for detailed information about the email servers, when they were installed, what type of server was installed, was email migrated forward. This is critical information to capture. In addition, as I scroll down here, one of the critical pieces of information regarding cached exchange mode, which is one of the configuration options in a Microsoft Exchange Outlook environment. So we want to capture detailed information about this. This is one of the most difficult aspects of building a data map, because interviewing the IT people and getting accurate information here can be challenging, because sometimes the IT folks don't understand the perspective that we're coming at this from, number one. Number two, organizations may not have one standard default in terms of how they've deployed the system. So it's very critical at this stage of the data mapping to be probing, to be comprehensive in the questioning process, and to be really the person that's doing the interviewing really needs to be knowledgeable about these IT systems in terms of how they're configured. So once the information is gathered, here's just one other sample worksheet. This is the file server worksheet. Once that information is gathered, essentially what we've done is we've created an ESI data map. So at the end of the process, what we should have is a comprehensive and defensible document. And I believe that it should be the embodiment of a reasonable and good faith effort to document the IT infrastructure. I don't believe it's possible to have a perfect document, but I think you can strive towards that and ultimately reach that reasonable and good faith objective. So let's switch back over to the PowerPoint. So how's an ESI data map used? It's a roadmap for where information is stored. It's a roadmap for the scope of the information, how old that information is, and it's a roadmap for what information has been deleted and purged over the years. It's an education tool. It's a reference tool. And I think one of the key things in using a data map is don't think of it as a tool that you can use in a vacuum. So if you're preparing for a meet and confer session, or if you're working on retention schedules, the data map should be used as a starting point, and it'll get you 90% of the way with regards to what you need to know about an IT system. But you still need to have that dialogue between legal and records and IT. The data map's not meant to be a replacement for the dialogue. It's meant to be a turbocharged facilitator of that dialogue. So let's talk briefly about how you maintain an ESI data map. It needs to be owned by somebody, preferably in legal or in records. There should be a regular review process established between the owner of the data map and IT. It's also prudent, I think, to have some type of an audit done, either annually, biannually. It just depends on the particular dynamics of the organization. And you can bring some automation to the table, either databases or some other sort of software approaches to maintaining the information. Some of the benefits from my perspective, and Kelly and Lisa will be talking about the benefits directly from their perspectives, but I think one of the key things I find in working with companies, inside counsel, outside counsel, and records managers, is that building an ESI data map is absolutely a tremendous framework for having this collaboration process between legal, records, and IT. It's a grassroots education. Every single conversation that I have with IT, and it usually numbers in the dozens, if not hundreds, over the course of a project, is an opportunity to educate IT about records management, about legal issues. And it really starts to create a culture of awareness among the IT professionals. And vice versa. It also does the same for legal and records and creates a culture of awareness of IT on their side of the table. There's a tremendous amount of gap identification between what policies state and what's actually happening on the IT systems. And of course, some of the practical or more, I guess more practical benefits: reducing the risk of sanctions, reducing the risk that there won't be enough time to adequately prepare for meet and confer. I mean, if you're under the gun to have to understand an organization's IT infrastructure within a month's time, good luck. That's all I have to say. It's not only trying to get the information of IT, it's following the sometimes complicated just business structure of some companies. One of the key benefits I want to highlight is it's much less disruptive to IT to build a data map proactively and do it over the course of 3 or 4 months or 6 months, as opposed to doing it in a fire drill context where the court's you're controlled by a court's docket. Having a data map represents, obviously, good faith effort to understand the infrastructure. You can make it more informed strategic decisions. And really, I think, the ultimate benefit is really in the organization's pocket. If you are more targeted in your identification of ESI, you're going to be more, you're going to preserve less information, collect information, and process less information. And at the end of the day, quite frankly, if you're able to knock out a couple of servers, if you're able to knock out a few data sources because you've mapped things out and you understand confidently that those sources should be off limits and you can negotiate a smaller scope of discovery, whatever ends up in this funnel over here that's getting processed is going to be significantly lessened. So with that, what I'd like to do is turn it over to Lisa Berry-Taman. And Lisa, you now have the floor.
All right, thank you. Hang on just a second, and let me switch over. All right. As John said, my name is Lisa Berry-Taman. I'm a senior consultant at Con Consulting. And Con Consulting, we're a consulting group, and we specialize in records management, information management, and information technology. I do want to highlight real quick that our founder, Randolph A. Kahn, just recently released his second edition of Information Nation. And with that, let's go over what I'm going to talk about in this presentation. Like the first presentation, I thought about changing up and jumping right into the connection between records management and data mapping. But again, I took a look at the attendee list, and you all out there are from all different industries, all different professions, all different departments. We've got RIM people, IT people, attorneys, business people. So I thought it would be remiss if I didn't start with the fundamentals again. Then I'll jump into the connection. Then I'm going to walk through a scenario demonstrating what I put a records manager can learn, but I would say now what anyone can learn from a data map. And then to conclude, I'm going to talk about what I think one of the most important benefits a data map brings to business. So let's go ahead and get started. This is the basic information life cycle. We're supposed to create information. It's supposed to have a life where we manage and use it, where there's business value, or you're keeping it because there's some kind of statutory or regulatory record-keeping requirement. But at some point, it's supposed to have a death after that business value ends or those record-keeping requirements are met. And that death is disposal. And disposal can range from, like with paper, it can range from just throwing it in a trash can to Department of Defense, National Security Administration compliant microcut shredding. Or with a hard drive, it can be just some kind of wipe utility or degaussing to some kind of physical destruction. But again, that information is supposed to have a death. But this is what we're seeing. We're seeing information being created, it is being used, but it's not being managed. There's no systematic or consistent disposal, and I see that for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes there's no records or information policy and procedure in place. Sometimes those policies and procedures are unenforced or unaudited. I've seen where there's no record retention schedule, or there's an unusable record retention schedule. Perhaps there are too many rules for people to follow, or they're missing departments, or just something doesn't work with it within that organization. Also, I'm seeing now poorly written legal holds affect this. People don't know what to do when they read the legal hold, so basically they just freeze and they keep everything. I've also seen overly broad legal holds where attorneys are asking their business clients to keep everything. And my personal opinion is that's due to the attorney's lack of understanding of technology and kind of their discomfort in determining where the case relevant information is within the client's infrastructure. So we end up seeing things that look like this. And if you see this in paper, you can imagine what it looks like electronically. And as records managers, this is what we're trying to do. We are trying to, in a systematic, consistent way, control information throughout that life cycle. And we do that by breaking information into two categories, record and non-record. And I'll start with well, let me define information. Information is basically all the information that's created or received by a user during the performance of their duties. And we break them down again into records and non-records. And non-record is you retain it for a short period of time because it either has no business value or little business value, and it's not subject to any kind of statutory or regulatory record-keeping requirements. Things like copies and drafts and emails about going to lunch are good examples of non-records. Records are very different. Records are intentionally retained and managed because they're evidence of the organization's activities, events, transactions, and the record has ongoing business, operational, legal, regulatory, or even historical value for that business. And we manage those by applying a record retention schedule. A record retention schedule is a list of records that need to be retained to satisfy various business, legal, regulatory, statutory requirements, and it will list how long a record should be kept. And the next slide I'm going to go over quickly is kind of an example of an entry into a record retention schedule. You see here, this is a big bucket approach. The rule is payroll records. You can see down here all the different types of records that are involved, payroll registers, earnings, and the retention period is 6 years. And due to time constraints, I'm not going to discuss the record retention schedule any further or these different approaches like Big Bucket, but if you're interested in further discussion, please contact me offline because this topic I think I could probably talk for the entire hour about, if not more. All right. Based on our experience at Consulting, this is what we've seen. We've seen that retention periods for records, most of them fall, as you see, within the 1 to 10 year range, 13% in the 10 to 30 year range, 25% in the event-based range. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that, event is, a perfect example is employment records. For certain employment records, you have to keep them for a number of years after the employment is terminated. So the end of employment is the event, and then you have to keep them for a number of years. What I do want to highlight is that very small little yellow chunk that is 7%. 7% of the records should be kept indefinitely. So that is such a small chunk in the overall realm of what we should be keeping indefinitely. And that's really important to keep that in mind as we go through this. Another thing that we've learned at Consulting is that 14% of records are in paper, 49% are strictly in electronic, and 37% are a hybrid. So what we learned from that very quickly is that 86% of the information that we are trying to manage as records managers is now in electronic format. So you very quickly see the connection between electronically stored information and records management. Well, the ESI data map tells you information about where that electronic data is stored. So now you can kind of see that the connection between records and information management and the ESI data map. What I want to do very quickly is kind of go through an example of a data map, and I want to thank John Collins with the Ingersoll firm for letting me use this. And it looks like I'm having a technical error here. Well, I will just skip that part. What I was going to show you was a data map that John put together. And basically what it shows within that data map is it tells you where the file servers are. And I think that John in his presentation kind of showed that when he's going through and looking at where this data is or where this information is stored, he's writing all that down. So we can tell where that information is stored. He also puts down information about, are there any restrictions on purging? And if they're not, as a records manager, we can learn that there may not be any kind of RIM or policies or procedures attached to or being applied to the electronically stored information if we see that there are no restrictions on purging. So we may want to follow up with IT on that. In the map that I was going to show you, it shows that the information they have back to 1997. And as we saw earlier, no retention schedule, as we learned earlier, only 55% of records have a retention period of 1 to 10 years. So there may not be a retention schedule being applied to this electronically stored data. So there's lots of things that a records manager can learn from an ESI data map. And when you look at it, how long it would take you to gather some of that information in a traditional way, it could take months, whereas if you looked through a data map that was already created, you can glean a lot of important information very quickly. And another thing you can always learn from a data map is that RIM professionals can add a lot of value to companies. And I say that because RIM professionals can reduce IT costs, and they do that by applying these appropriate record retention schedules to the electronic stored information. It reduces the volume, which increases the likelihood of a successful recovery if there's any kind of crash. And it just, like I said, it reduces the overall storage and management cost associated with storing that electronic information. with the IT department, records managers can also raise awareness of RIM issues that, if not addressed, can have very serious consequences. And I'm going to show you, give you some examples of those consequences here in this next slide. Are You Kidding Me? And I've highlighted this down below. Are You Kidding Me is a blog that we write at Con Consulting where we talk about these disconnects between IT and legal and records management. We also write a blog called Information Nation, Info Nation, that I put down at the bottom. But let me give you a couple of examples here. An IT department sets up an email archiving solution and sets it to save all emails from every end user in the company. And it's 6 months before records management hears about that, and legal was also uninformed. So you can see, I mean, just imagine what could happen if they received a notice of litigation during that time period where they're storing all this information that nobody knew about. And what if somebody made a flippant comment like the one that some people made at another company, which is fat people scared of a silly little lung problem. And that was actually a quote that was taken from an email, and that comment was attributed to an entire company, and it had disastrous results for that company. So you don't want disconnects like that to happen. Another disconnect I've seen is a records management department decides to update their records management policy, which is a great thing to do. But they add the following statement: the records management policy and record retention schedule apply to both paper and electronic records. And unfortunately, this records management department continued to only manage paper. And then they just assumed that IT was going to be responsible for the electronically stored information. And as we saw in that slide with the lady with all of the paper, you can imagine if no one is controlling that electronically stored information, what that looks like. All right. In conclusion, my feeling is the true benefit of a data map to records and information management is that it opens lines of communication between the departments, as John highlighted in his part of the presentation. There has been such a major shift in business and technical landscape that has caused a convergence between IT and legal and RIM and privacy, and it requires that all of these departments not only have technical knowledge, but they have business knowledge, they understand legal concepts, they understand records management and how that works. And an ESI data map can open those lines of communication between departments that have truthfully not worked very well together in the past, and many times just when they did work together it was not successful. And having a tool that allows people from different departments, different professions, different fields of study and education levels that use different vocabularies to have an intelligent, productive discussion about where and how company information is being stored and protected is an invaluable tool. And then having an ESI map in connection with policies and procedures in records and information management and privacy, a record retention schedule, and a litigation preparedness plan for ESI makes up a powerful toolkit for companies in our day and age of compliance. That is it for me. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of our webinar. I'm going to turn the presentation over now to a partner at Quarles & Brady, someone that we call the point guard of eDiscovery. Please join me in welcoming my fellow co-presenter, Kelly Twigger. Kelly, whenever you're ready.
Thanks very much, Lisa. Can you now see my computer on your screen?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. As John mentioned earlier, my name is Kelly Twigger. I'm a partner in the Milwaukee office of Quarles & Brady. And I head up our records retention and electronic discovery team here within Quarles & Brady, which is nationwide across our offices. And we also host a blog at ediscovery.quarles.com called eDiscovery Bites, where we attempt to address a lot of the issues that arise in the electronic arena from a variety of perspectives. The team members that we have on that blog span a number of practice groups in our organization, so I would encourage you to visit it when you have the urge to look at some of these issues. Following up on John and Lisa's presentations, where John has shown us, what a data map actually looks like and some of the benefits of it, and Lisa's talked about how it fits into a records and information management strategy, I want to talk about it from a litigation perspective. And we think about electronic discovery in a couple of contexts. You can either wait until your company gets hit with litigation and attempt to react to it, in which case you are acting more like the tornado slide, or you can be prepared for dealing with it and sail on through having to produce electronic information in a calm blue way. And so generally what I tell clients is this is your opportunity to get prepared, to put a litigation preparedness strategy in place to make sure that you know within your organization where the sources of electronic information are. The storm can be likened to what John mentioned earlier as the fire drill approach, and often organizations who don't have the kind of collaboration and communication across departments that both Lisa and John have discussed often end up in the tornado. I think of it, sometimes I often use the analogy with clients of if you've seen The Perfect Storm with George Clooney, where he opts towards the latter part of the movie to drive out to try and catch more fish into what ends up to be the perfect storm when he had the option to turn around and go the safe route. And in this sort of situation with clients, when you understand the expenses associated with not knowing where your electronic information is stored and how much more that costs you, even in a very small litigation situation, then you understand the value of getting a litigation preparedness program in place. Oftentimes, my clients will say, as John mentioned earlier, how come I can't just go to IT? How come IT doesn't know where all the information is stored? Why shouldn't I just be able to call my IT folks when I have a litigation hold in place and tell them to hold on to somebody's email? Well, when somebody asks me that question, I point them to this picture, and you should be seeing a set of bookshelves in front of you. And if you think of these bookshelves and all of the books on them as your organization's IT infrastructure and the books on them as all of the ESI within the organization, you need to understand what different people's roles are with regard to this information. IT's job is to build these bookshelves. They build the side shelves, the middle shelves. The idea is for them to build whatever infrastructure they need to maintain the electronic information that is within the organization. So whatever applications and hardware the organization needs to conduct its business, whether it's ERP software, customer relationship management information, email, instant messaging, any of those things that an organization needs to conduct its business. It's IT's job to make those all work together and to be on this infrastructure and to make sure these shelves don't fall down. And that is what their job is. Their job is not to know anything about the electronic information that is stored on those bookshelves. A record manager's job is to manage the small part of all of these books that are on here that are actually the business records of the organization. And we'll talk probably in the next webinar a little bit more about the difference between records and a lot of the other electronic information that's included in an organization, but suffice to say that not all information that is created is a business record. So all information that's created are documents and therefore discoverable in litigation. All business records are documents. All electronic communications are documents. But not all electronic communications or documents are business records. So that's an important distinction. So the record manager's job is to manage just those records, to establish a policy and schedules to keep and cull those records with user assistance. Now, if you have inside counsel or outside counsel who comes to your organization once litigation has been filed, putting aside the legal hold at this time, and their job is to look on these bookshelves and find the red book on the third shelf with the third paragraph of information, because that's what's relevant and responsive to the claims at issue in the litigation or the government's investigation or the third-party subpoena that the organization has received. And the question is, how is that lawyer going to know where to go to search for that electronic information? Because as of now, we've defined everybody's roles related to these bookshelves, and nobody's job is to know exactly where the electronic information is stored. That's where the value of the data map comes in. Prior to the new rules on electronic discovery, there was no involvement from IT. Lawyers came into the organization, worked with inside counsel, went directly to the business people. We grabbed email from the business people off their hard drive. Maybe we discussed with IT the limited role that we wanted them to have in gathering some information. We got paper files. We took them back to our offices. We reviewed them. We produced them. There was very little, if any, involvement from IT. Now, because 95%, maybe closer to 99% of the information created in an organization is electronic, IT has to be at the forefront of the discussion. John showed you before a framework of a house, and for me, in working with clients to put together a litigation preparedness program, and I find that term to be very awkward, so if anyone has a better idea of a way to describe it, please let me know. I tend to refer to them as records and information management initiatives, because that sort of encompasses the legal hold policy and all of the pieces that need to go in that realm. And the data map is the foundation of that solid program for preparing for preserving, collecting, reviewing, and producing electronic information. And when my client calls me and says, I need to put a litigation hold in place, the first questions that I ask are, what types of information are we looking for, and where does it live on their IT system? And if the client has not mapped that IT system, then locating that information is very difficult. So how does the data map help us identify where information resides? Well, generally speaking, and this is very general, there are 5 main sources of information in most organizations today. Email, information on an ERP system such as SAP or Oracle, information on what I've lumped together where you see the icons for Word, Excel, and PowerPoint as information that's contained on file and print servers. That can be customer specific. You know, in an organization that develops a lot of patents, you're going to have a lot of drawings, a lot more CAD information, other types of documents, but that's just one generic category. Legacy systems, which are older systems that the organization used previously, which are no longer running at full capacity. They're in a reduced mode, but which information is still available on them that needs to be accessible for the organization for business purposes. We see a lot of legacy systems with our clients who do a fair number of acquisitions, and instant messaging. So we've got those 5 main sources of information, and a data map tells us where they reside. So when we see, you should be seeing on your screen little things that are popping up showing us all different kinds of places where data can live and be added. From these 5 main sources of information, there's all different kinds of places where they can reside. Information can be being saved these days on cloud computers, in wikis. A lot of organizations are using SharePoint portals. Organizations use shared drives. Copies of email can be stored to servers for those who use Lotus Notes. Many individuals have their own PST or folder systems that they can use to store their email. And if you just think about it, where did you have to go to get the email that you needed to log into this webinar today? You needed to have that specific information. Did you cut and paste the information from the email into your calendar so you only had to pull up the calendar entry? Did you go to a shared drive that you stored it so other people could see the information and log on today? Did you keep it in a personal folder? Where did you have that information? And you get a firm understanding of how many different places information can reside. Now, in producing electronic information in discovery, we don't have to produce many duplicate copies of the same information, but we have to make sure that we gather everything. And to be able to say that we've preserved everything and gathered it when necessary, we have to know where it all resides. Okay, benefits of a data map. John's covered several of the benefits of a data map. But from a litigation perspective, I think that one of the most important ones is creating the awareness in IT of the need to be able to gather electronically stored information. And one of the key benefits that I have heard from my clients who've engaged in the data mapping process and put a plan in place is that they end up with a lot of benefits to IT using the data map that they did not foresee. For instance, they'll see that they've had 5 or 6 different applications that deployed at the same time that essentially do the same thing, and most of their users are not using 3 to 4 of those applications, so they can shut those down and allocate resources elsewhere within the organization. It's also created tremendous communication within the IT department to allow them to involve or get involved in programs that they thought they couldn't do for years, but now they suddenly have the information in front of them that allows them to do more collaboration within their own group. Some IT departments and some of our larger Fortune 15 clients are very large. Cost savings and risk minimization. We've talked a little bit about, I think Mike talked at the very beginning about the ability to save on the EDRM model, and John talked about it a little bit, but typically the costs, the biggest costs in discovery of electronic information are in the attorney review costs. So if we preserve the information, we collect it, once we pull it out and we send it to attorneys to review, if you think about 1 gigabyte of information, and all of the hard drives of the computers that you're all sitting in front of are likely 40 or 80 gigabyte hard drives. 1 gigabyte of information, if printed out and put back to back, is roughly the equivalent of about 70 to 80 banker boxes of documents. So if you think about all the attorney time that's involved in reviewing all those documents, what you want to do is cull down as much information as you can. And there are 2 ways to do that. 1, not keep information in your environment that you don't need to have. So make good decisions about what's useful from a business perspective, and then get rid of the rest of it as long as you're in compliance with records retention schedules and the like. The other is to engage in filtering processes and using technology in the discovery process to minimize the amount of information that needs to be reviewed. So that's a cost savings issue. We also talked a little bit about some of the cost benefits that you have from IT. Risk minimization, and I apologize for the spelling error on this slide there. Really what you want to do is minimize any risk that the company is ever going to be involved in a motion to compel or a motion for sanctions for spoliating electronic information. So if you've got a good system in place, a regular process that you follow in implementing a hold, in identifying your players, in knowing where your sources of electronic information are, and in preserving, collecting, and producing that information, you've got a solid, defensible process that you can be happy to stand up in front of a judge and defend if necessary. Next benefit is really helping to identify a 30B6 witness for your organization who can be the person to testify about where the sources of information are within your organization. Typically, when you have not done a data map, because of what we talked about earlier with regard to the bookshelves and what IT's roles are, educating a 30B6 representative can be very challenging without that data map. Together with the data map and an analysis of the litigation portfolio and the goals of the organization, it's a lot easier to make decisions within your organization of what kind of initiatives to take on in IT. Should we limit the number of places that people can store particular types of information? Should we tell people that we just want to use one collaborative tool? Instead of using Quick Places and SharePoint, we just want to use, I guess Quick Places is a Lotus and SharePoint is an exchange, but instead of using multiple collaboration sites, you just want to use one. Then you have a tool that allows you to search that information for electronic discovery. When you have a larger litigation portfolio, those decisions become more complex, and the types of litigation that's involved, if you are typically having to produce quantitative data in government investigations or state agency investigations as opposed to product liability litigation or class action litigation, all of those types of litigation tend to lend themselves to producing different types of information. What is it that you're going to need? In a class action, an antitrust class action situation, email is going to be the most important. In a product liability case, design drawings are going to be probably more important. So you need to think about that in terms of what your litigation looks like within your organization and how you think that will evolve over time. One of what I believe to be the best benefits of a data map is to allow me to create for my clients an electronic discovery guide. And I want to show you a little bit of a sample guide that we've created, and you'll notice that it has a Star Wars theme to it, and that's because my 6-year-old is all Star Wars all the time and was sitting with me when I was putting this together. So the sample electronic discovery guide, what it essentially is a 15 to 20 page guide that covers is sort of the face to all of the other pieces of a records and information management initiative or a litigation preparedness program for an organization. It walks through elements of the map, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. And it shows, it outlines from a litigator's perspective. It takes the technical information that's in the map and puts it in litigation speak. So for instance, here's the backup system that stores this information. Can we argue whether it is accessible or inaccessible under the federal rules? So it talks a little bit about the map, includes special practice tips for counsel, but also includes, the litigation hold protocol that the organization would follow. And this is going to be specific to every organization as to who the people are that are going to be responsible for implementing it and affecting it, and a sample legal hold notice for the organization. Some of which is more boilerplate, I think, across organization, because the simpler the hold notices are, the better. A key players questionnaire, which gets sent to people who are identified as custodians of documents that may be relevant or responsive in the organization. I generally send this electronically and have information returned, and then we can target specific people who need to be, we can be in touch with IT. So we use the links that are created in the data map of who the IT contacts are for specific areas of electronically stored information. And once we get this questionnaire back from custodians of the information, we know exactly what needs to be targeted. And so we go to IT and have them make the appropriate take the appropriate preservation steps. We also include in here a full copy of the data map, and we link to the data map multiple times within the electronic discovery guide to really highlight for outside counsel what are the key pieces of the map that they need to be focused on and where they can gain the best pieces of information moving forward. We also include the retention policy for the organization as well as the retention schedule so that counsel can be aware of the length that records are kept for particular areas. For instance, in acquisition litigation, when board meeting minutes or things are important to be produced in discovery, then there are discussions of who keeps those minutes and where counsel needs to go. It minimizes effort, too, on behalf of inside counsel, especially in our clients that don't have large in-house counsel departments and don't want to be managing every aspect of a document production for a large piece of litigation. Our outside counsel guide allows counsel to be able to know those business people within the organization to communicate with. It's also a very effective tool for our in-house counsel who are in large legal departments for them to be able to facilitate those type of production notices. So what type of information is in the actual electronic, in the guide here that's helpful? And I think what I want to do is jump here to the sources of electronic information. Within this organization, you see the 5 main sources that we looked at on that slide earlier. The email system, email, we see instant messaging, documents contained on file and print servers, SAP is their ERP system, and legacy systems. And just for a quick, I wanted to show you by way of example, in this organization, the email backup system, this organization uses both Domino Web Access and also Lotus Notes. And the Domino mail servers are backed up via TSM using hard disk storage, which is not magnetic tape. So we're not talking about backup tapes that you hear about regularly that need to be restored. And what's important about that is that when you're looking at accessibility regarding backups, if you were ever needing to go to the backup tapes and pull information, you should review from this guide will tell you that IT can actually restore those tapes themselves. So it's unlikely that you'll be able to make an inaccessibility argument unless there's a question about undue burden of being able to restore them. In this situation, it's very easy for them to do that. Other key information is that the backup system, this email system, is designed for disaster recovery only, and email backups are only retained on a 30-day basis. So here we talk about, practically speaking, any preservation or production of any email older than 30 days will have to be located somewhere other than the backup system. And for those of you out there who've been involved in litigation, you know that it is unlikely, unless the issue giving rise to litigation is still ongoing between the parties, that it's going to be more likely that email is going to be implicated that is going to be much older. 6 months to 4 years, 10 years, something like that. And then, our guide also includes who's the contact person and links directly to the system in the data map to have all of his information available for view there. So that's a quick look at the data map. I'm sorry, quick look at the outside counsel guide. Benefits of a data map. I'm just going to run through these quickly, actually. I'm going to move kind of over these. We've talked about most of them, and John's gone through those because I wanted to cover quickly the privilege issue. A lot of clients ask me, well, if I do this data map, is this a privileged document? And that's a question that has not been addressed by a court at this point. As we all know, there's a lot of law that's developing out there on electronic discovery very quickly, but this issue has not come up yet. My analysis in a traditional attorney-client privilege or even attorney work product situation is that a data map shows the sources of electronically stored information that are available within an organization, and that is information that I can get through a 30B6 deposition of an organization's witness, and I think that that information is very likely discoverable. So it's likely that a data map may not be privileged. You might be able to make an argument that it's shielded by a work product doctrine if you do the map through counsel, and we often have our clients, we often engage the data mapping consultants like John to conduct the data maps and include them in the outside counsel guide as a fluid program on a REM initiative so that we try to attach as much protection to it as possible. I do think that you could make some arguments that the entire data map is overbroad for purposes of production, and you could offer a 30B6 deposition of an IT person who has knowledge of the sources from the data map as an alternative. Another alternative is to provide perhaps some sort of visual of the data map, and I had one but neglected to include it today, to show where a potential user's availability of storing certain types of information are, and it may be that you use one for each of the different types of information available within an organization. Just to finish up quickly, the size of the organization does not diminish the importance, but just changes the investment that needs to be made in the data map. I think that there are a lot of key decisions that can be made about how much to map within your particular organization, what your litigation portfolio looks like. But giving thought to that is very important for every organization. A data map, the more it's used, even in small matters, the greater the value becomes. It's been my experience in putting together data maps with clients that clients recoup the cost of a data map with one preservation production of electronic information. So in one litigation hold situation, just the amount of data that is culled as a result of the overall process of working with the data map and the amount of attorney time that is not spent trying to track down the various sources of information is recouped in one go. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Sydney Petro of NextPage. Sydney is the Chief Marketing Officer at NextPage. And NextPage is a software vendor that focuses on information risk management. So take it away, Sydney.
Great. Thank you, Kelly. Great. Well, I'm happy to come on here at the end. And as you were talking about the data map, I thought we have just some interesting things here to share that I think help also build those business cases and really do sit on that proactive end of what's happening with e-discovery. I wanted to throw out for everyone just a few of the stats about what we find on the cost of unmanaged documents. So in the data map, obviously you get to cover all aspects of all documents across the enterprise. And from the NextPage perspective, we focus a lot on the cost of those unmanaged documents. Couple of stats there. It's estimated there's 7.5 billion office documents created annually, and 80% of those are sitting outside traditional centralized repositories. And a couple of the drivers that are happening to drive actually controlling these documents are focused on the cost to the enterprise and the risk to the enterprise. On the cost side, I just wanted to throw out a couple of these terms. There's actually the cost of storage, because ultimately, if you can clean up the information that's sitting out there, then when you hit discovery, there's a lot less information to cull through. The cost of storage side, the stats out there say that storage capacity needs are doubling every 2 to 3 years, and the cost to fully manage 1 terabyte of storage on a Tier 1 storage basis is about $24,000. If that terabyte moves into discovery, the average cost of that is about $1.5 million. There's a very famous case study out there from DuPont where they reviewed a past litigation, and they found of 70 million responsive documents, 39 million of those should have been disposed of according to policy but weren't and had to go into review. And the cost to review just those documents was $12 million. The average organization over $1 billion in revenue has about 147 active litigations. They could just be at the preservation stage, but they have about 147 of those. So there's a huge cost structure that gets created in addition to the risk to the enterprise. So whether that's reputational or smoking gun documents, we have customers whose clients are requiring them contractually to clean up all working copies. One customer profiled the organization. For every one document that got created, they were guaranteed 32 permutations. And for a project team that works over the course of 3 to 4 months, they will generate 3,000 to 5,000 documents, of which 100 of those must be kept and are records of the organization. The problem is they don't actually know how to clean up that information, and that's where NextPage is focused. NextPage is focused on this ability to tie what we call a digital thread through every document and its subsequent versions. So no matter if a document's on a hard drive, an email attachment, a USB key drive, a shared drive, SharePoint, or any other centralized repository, we understand how they're related, we tie this digital thread through, and then we allow you to remotely take action on any of those documents, whether that's notifying users, deleting those emails, copying those emails, moving those. You can be as interactive or as aggressive as you want with your users in order to be able to enforce policy across the organization, and those cost and risk drivers are the reasons for that. The only other thing I wanted to show you is actually what this digital thread starts to look like. So as users work in the organization, this agreement document, they end up with the system just tracks what's happening from the user's perspective no matter what they do. So whether they save those documents, there's first 2 copies in Outlook, put it on a key drive, save it to just My Documents, or even put a copy in SharePoint, the system is just tracking what's going on and then enabling you to reduce cost and reduce risk and extend control from the center of the organization all the way out to those edge users. That is really where the risk created and really where the 80% of documents are sitting in an organization. And with that, I think I turn it back to you, John.
Thanks, Cindy. This is John Collins again, and I'm going to go ahead and grab the presentation back. And I think from my perspective as someone that works with IT professionals and IT organizations throughout the country, I think what HP and NextPage and other infrastructure vendors, well, I don't want to state that NextPage is necessarily an infrastructure vendor, but what I think some of the technologies that are most interesting to me are the technologies that address information up front at the information governance stage before you ever even have a whisper about any kind of litigation. So thank you very much. And I believe Cindy and Mike are going to stay on and help us with the answering of questions. But you should see on the screen a slide, the next webinar in the series, which we had originally planned on doing April 1st, but realized we needed to push it out. So the next in the HP and NextPage sponsored series will be the eDiscovery Toolkit, the tools your organization needs to manage information in an electronic world. That's Wednesday, April 22nd, 12 p.m. Central, 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and I believe that's 10 a.m. Pacific Time, and your same host of presenters. So with that, we'd like to move into the question and answer phase, and we do have a number of questions in the question queue, and what I'm going to do is go ahead and pull those out and just start asking them. And I've got one here which I think I'd like to probably throw out to our sponsors. I guess, Cindy, if you could talk maybe, Cindy, about one of the questioners asks, please briefly define structured and unstructured data.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. So the way we usually think about structured, unstructured, and there's even a class people call semi-structured data. Structured data is what you typically think of that sits in a database or that's usually heavily transactional. It's very structured. It's got an object model. It's sitting, and almost all structured data sits in a centralized repository. Semi-structured data is considered things like email. is considered semi-structured because it's mostly centralized. It's got a model underneath it. Unstructured is typically what's considered out sitting on end users' machines. It's all of this content that has no common structure throughout it, and it's all different types of files that are sitting out there. So those are usually the three ways that it breaks down. And we've figured out in the world how to be really good at managing structured data, because those are usually centralized assets and they're usually stored in things like databases. But unstructured data is when people talk about the mass proliferation of information that's sitting on users' machines, it's all usually focused on unstructured information that's out there.
Great. Thank you very much. And then a question for Mike. Mike, what technologies do you see the infrastructure vendors like HP coming out with, I mean, that specifically manage the data that resides on things like storage area networks, and network attached storage?
Yeah, and so the key that we see is, like we talked about, is that everything really is the record, and so being able to locate and find those and help organizations, manage that data. And Sydney really referred to it as, the cost of acquisition of storage is fairly inexpensive, but it's only 20% of the cost of that storage over the life cycle. So there ends up being two types of messages that end up helping. One is optimize that Tier 1 storage, reduce the amount of it that you actually need, and so how do you go about and classify that data and put it into a storage infrastructure that is designed to meet the retention time of that given data element. And so you get savings from reducing Tier 1 storage and thus the associated operational expenses associated with that. But then also from the compliance and discovery, having the tools there to quickly find the data that you need, whether it's reactive for like an audit or a litigation request, or whether it's in day-to-day workings. There's a study out there that says knowledge workers spend an hour a day looking for information. We spend more time looking for the information than we actually spend using it. And so there's some very, very intangible costs out there that are very valuable to organizations that can be delivered with the same infrastructure.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Mike. Another question, which I think I'll put in Kelly's corner, is someone asks Kelly, regarding the use of a data map by outside counsel, 200 pages seems like a lot to digest, particularly if a firm uses multiple outside counsel. Is it practical, or do you have some sort of summary or briefer versions? And then I guess the second part of the question is, do you recommend turning the data map over to outside counsel, or do you recommend using the data map as a guide for discussion in a 26F setting?
The answer to all of your questions is exactly why I created the electronic discovery guide. And that guide was meant to, because when I worked with clients in putting together data maps, and they were hundreds of pages long, I looked at it and said, this is not something that outside counsel is going to be able to disseminate quickly and find the information they need to know. So what I did is took that map, because I've developed the technical background to be able to understand the information that's in the data map, and I've converted it to litigator speak, so that we put in the key parts of the map, the key pieces of information that are targeted for litigation, and that guide, which is really the face of the map and all the other pieces that the organization uses to manage the ESI, is only about 15 to 20 pages long. So it's that guide that I think is really the best tool to hand to your outside counsel. If you put it in this electronic format that we use, which is an Adobe Pro document, then giving them the data map also allows them to reference that material as they need it, as something comes up. But it's not something that they necessarily need to have, and it's not something that I think, unless you have e-discovery counsel that are pretty technical and knowledgeable in these situations, that they're going to be able to do a whole lot with. I say that with the caveat that, having worked with John on a number of projects, he does write very well and in as much plain language as possible without avoiding any of the technical drawbacks. Attorneys just aren't that technically savvy yet.
Right, I agree, and I think one of the nice things about that is it does bridge the gap between the level of detail, and that sort of brings up another question that one of our attendees asked, which is what are some key things that undermine the defensibility of an ESI data map? And I think that's not an easy question to answer, but I think that that reasonable good faith standard is one that has to be aspired to. And I think when building the data map, the people that are involved with the project need to understand the balance between what reasonable good faith means in the context of the case law, the Sedona Conference commentaries, and the other leading, leading discussions on the subject. And you really need to really blend all that, because I mean a good example is it necessary to understand every single router and every single operating system and every single router in an organization's IT infrastructure? I mean, that is part of the IT infrastructure. Is it necessary to do that? I don't see anywhere in any case law or the Sedona Conference where it says that you have to identify precisely the exact path that information takes in the regular course of your business operations. That's not to say that it couldn't be relevant. The Columbia Pictures Brunel, I'm not sure if that's the exact name of the case, but where the ruling was that the defendant, I believe it was the defendant, had to preserve this RAM memory information. I mean, that was case specific. That didn't say that you have to preserve RAM in every single computer system that you have. But I think what might undermine the defensibility of an ESI data map is that you don't have a process in place and you don't have a method in place to try to gather the information. And I think that falls back to how much time did you take and what way did you go about ensuring a comprehensive picture of the IT infrastructure was gathered. So,
John, can I add two things to
Oh,
your
yeah,
answer?
please. Anybody else, any of our other panelists that want to chime in, please.
I think I have two things that I think might undermine the defensibility of a good data map or any litigation preparedness program or RIM initiative, however you choose to categorize it. One would be not keeping up your data map. If you map your systems today and you let it sit for a year, 2 years, 3 years, in most of our organizations, IT initiatives are happening every year on a very large scale, and IT initiatives that can happen that can completely change the sources of where information is stored. And so not maintaining that data map could break down its defensibility in front of a court. The second thing I think that may undermine a data map is if you don't do a nice analysis of what your typical litigation has been within your organization and consider, based on the industry that you're in, what types of litigation you could be facing in making decisions on what areas of your system to map. For instance, should you map just your North American infrastructure, or do you see a lot of litigation overseas or related to your overseas entities? Is it in China? Is it in the European Union? Do you need to be considering privacy laws, and how much of that do you need to map? So I think those are two places where you really need to be making educated decisions in doing the mapping.
Yeah, absolutely. And for what it's worth, for my experience is that most organizations that I work with that build data maps usually start with the United States or North America as their focus, and then start to look at other parts of their enterprise after that. I want to get Lisa in here with a question for Lisa Berry-Taman. Lisa, one of the attendees asks, what about records that get scanned into images for ease of document production? Now you have multiple copies. How should they be managed?
Well, it depends on what the policies and procedures are within that organization. I mean, I know some organizations, they're okay with having multiple copies, having one in paper and one in electronic, and they manage both. Other organizations take the opinion that they have a defensible copy in that scanned version, therefore they can get rid of their paper version. So it really depends on the organization, but if you are going to have two sets, you do have to manage both sets. So it can be much easier to just manage one, wherever that might be, whether it be a paper or electronic.
Okay. And
John, can I add one thing to that?
Oh, yeah, please, absolutely.
When you're scanning images in, from a practical perspective, managing data that's in a format other than its native format is going to be challenging with different types of software.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry, Kelly. Were you asking me a question, or I was reading another questioner? But
I was commenting on the question that someone just raised about scanning.
Oh, okay. All right. When you stopped, it occurred to me that you may have been asking me a question, but since you didn't, that's good. So, and I was reading the next question, which I think I want to ask Lisa again. Put this one in Lisa's lap, but if any of the other panelists would like to chime in after Lisa, please feel free to do so. This question is, in order to work effectively with the legal department on their e-discovery process, where do you start if your RIM program currently does not manage electronic records and there is not a tool or application in place to manage electronic records?
Well, the person who asked that's at an interesting point in their records and information management program. You know, not all companies can afford to have tools in place to manage electronically stored information, and so what you do is you try to handle it to the best of your ability with policy and procedure, and give people ideas and thoughts about where you want them to keep this information, and audit that. So it's a lot of you know, people time rather than you know, tool expense to do that, but companies can do that. And I'm trying to think, what was the next part of the question? How to interact with legal at this point?
Yeah, where do you start? Yeah, so it's if they don't have a tool or application to really manage electronic records, and their RIM program does not encompass electronic records. So, you know, how do you work effectively with legal on the e-discovery process? So I guess the problem is that if you don't have tools in place to manage information, and you're not really officially, I don't know how you would refer to it, managing the electronic records under your organization's RIM program. Yeah, I guess in one respect you're excluding the RIM process.
Right. You're in a difficult situation, and I think that's what, you know, you need to have that open dialogue with legal and explain that to them, where you are, and you know, the things that you'd like to do as far as managing the electronically stored information. You might want to include IT in on that conversation, because they may be assuming that you're doing it. And you know, nothing's being done. And again, like I said, there are numbers of ways you can do that as an organization if you can't afford to buy particular tools. You know, you can do it with the policies, procedures, and audits, and making sure that people are storing electronically what they should be storing, and that they are applying a record retention schedule and those rules to those particular electronically stored records. And also, I would suggest to you that you go, during that conversation between IT and legal, that you talk about your litigation whole process, and how would you, if right now today, in the state that you're in, if you had litigation, what would you do and how would you handle it? And you know, those will kind of lead you to different ways on where you need to start first to protect yourself.
And I think the other thing I would point out, and I would add, and I would be interested to see if Cindy and Mike have any comments on this, but from my perspective, again, working very, very much, I mean, I would say 80% of my time is really spent with the IT folks in the course of building the data map, is that there are a number of sort of native tools, or I don't know if I want to call them tools, but just native functionality in some systems, such as Microsoft Windows Server 2003 or 2008, you know, and Microsoft Exchange and Outlook. There are native tools, things that are called group policy, which is a method for managing certain Microsoft software. And my experience is that most organizations don't leverage those to a very large degree. And those types of native tools that are already built into Microsoft are pretty basic, and they're not meant, and they don't address the types of issues, certainly not that what Next Page was talking about, but they do provide some basic sort of policing that can occur on IT systems, and I think that, coupled with policies that are sensible and have some teeth, can be an effective way to address management of electronic information. I mean, before anyone, if anyone asked me and said, hey, should we go out and buy this tool or that tool, I would certainly recommend that the organization understand very clearly and specifically what systems they already have in place and how they can manage those systems better and what policies they want, and then look at the different types of tools. So I don't know, Cindy and Mike, do you have any comments or thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in. I think one of the things that is proven to be true over every customer I've been in is everyone has a different set of tools and locations where they store information. And some of those repositories have lots of information and some of them have little. And I think one of the most important things as organizations look at tools is understanding how their users work and how what they're going to do helps them do what they're going to do. I have yet to see anyone really be able, unless they're a complete command and control environment, really change the way that their users are working. And so what I think we find has to happen is there has to be this sense of users are going to use their machines, they're going to use email, they're going to use their shared drives. If they've deployed SharePoint, they're going to use SharePoint, whatever those places are. And you have to figure out how to control the information and get your arms around it at all of those locations. Because users are really bad at changing the way they work, which is the reason 80% of the stuff is sitting on their own personal machines. And so figuring out what systems you have and then overlaying that with the ability to say, okay, wait, I can watch what's going on here and I can take my policies and actually actively apply them. Just as a stat, we did a study with CIO Magazine and found that 60% of organizations said they had a written document retention policy, but less than 30% of those knew how to actively enforce it. And I think that's just a really consistent story that even if you have a policy, finally now we are actually getting technologies that let them actively enforce it across the organization without requiring a big bucket where everything has to go.
Thanks, Denise. Mike, any thoughts on that? Or?
Yeah. Going back, if the RIM policy doesn't cover electronically stored information, then I think the organization has to just decide, right? Is the value of the data stored in that electronically and the risk associated with not managing that germane to the organization? And if it's not, or if the amount of risk is very low, then that really scopes what kind of tools should be applied to it. And like you said, John, right, using the native operating systems or the application tools to manage that data. But if that risk is higher, if it is important, and more organizations, that electronically stored information is more and more important to the daily business functions, then it comes back to, well, what kind of functionality does the organization need to effectively manage it? And there's always a trade-off. Is it a higher management cost with more labor-intensive to manage it, or do you make a bigger investment in the application to manage that data so it's easier and can spread across multiple organizations more easily? And so that's the approach that I would look at from scoping what the problem and what potential solutions may be.
Right, and I think that just kind of highlights, at least from my perspective, not all organizations are the same. I've done some work with some companies where they're highly regulated, or I know of some companies such as pharmaceutical companies where they are so intensive with regards to their processes for managing information that they actually are the type of organization where they will dictate to their users and lock things down in such a way where you can't have email anywhere but on the server, and they have very rigid policies in place because of the nature of their environment. But that's the exception, not the rule. I think the rule is the organizations where the users really dictate how their work process, and that's the way it should be, because let's face it, the whole purpose of having information infrastructure isn't to be worried about litigation, it's to do business, do whatever the business mission of the organization is and accomplish that. So one question that,
I was going to jump in, and so many times we leave users to themselves. We don't give them any kind of direction about where we want them to keep their electronically stored information. We have this broad policy, but we never break it down into procedures and directives and give them guidance on where to store this information. So I think that's so important as well, that we talk with them and we give them good ways to store their information.
Yeah, if I can jump in as well, Lisa, one of the things that we recommend to our clients when they're instituting a RIM initiative and putting in an electronic communications policy that covers all electronic information, or electronic communications, whether it's email, instant messaging, text messaging, anything that's out there, tweeting these days, that there be some training for the business people about the policy and about what it means and about what the organization's goals are from a business perspective, because those business people are out there every day busting their rear ends to build that business, and they don't want to upend that business by doing something negative in making a quick transmission of a text message or something in that regard. So we do training, and oftentimes it can be a webinar training that is saved, and it's something that clients go on and the business people access when they have time to do it, and then they check an attendance sheet that they have seen and reviewed the training. So that's a process that a number of organizations implement for lots of different training methodologies, and doing it for the electronic communications is just an easy way to do that within an organization that already has that set up.
Right, establishing that governance before everything gets out of control.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting, but it's a lot of what I think a big piece of the puzzle of successfully dealing with these issues is education and knowledge. It's not necessarily going out and buying tools and saying, okay, let's spend some money on something. It's intelligently understanding what you've got, and then being able to match that with whatever tools there might be. And like Mike said, if the risk management is high, then obviously that may warrant investments in significant tools to help manage things. If the risk is low, then maybe just education, some blend of just education and some other just native tool tweaking in terms of managing the information is called for. So, but in any event, I want to thank all our panelists, Lisa and Kelly and Mike and Cindy with NextPage and Hewlett-Packard for sponsoring. This concludes our webinar, and we will be making this available on Quarrel's website shortly, within a couple days, and we will be sending out the PowerPoint in a separate email to our attendees. And again, thank you very much for attending, and look for our next webinar on April 22nd.
John, can I just add one quick thing before
go ahead,
drops off? And that is that if there are questions that you had that didn't get addressed today, or that we can assist you in following up on, please feel free to contact any of us individually by email or through the contact information, the PowerPoint, or our website. And thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Kelly. And with that, that concludes today's webinar. Thank you.